Hello everyone, this is Mark Fingerhut. This is my presentation about my 2019 Missouri River trip from Yellowstone to the Arch by Kayak. Thanks for tuning in. I've had a limited chance to give this presentation in public, something about a global pandemic, blah, blah, blah. But I've had a handful of opportunities to present this live, but I have not yet recorded this. And I know a lot of people have been asking me, a lot of folks wanted to see this presentation, but were unable to see it in person. So here you are. Here's my presentation. I hope you enjoy it. So 2019, I took a trip on the Missouri River, plus a little bit more, and I put in on the Madison River, just where the river comes out of Yellowstone National Park. And I did 100 miles on the beautiful Madison River to the town of Three Forks, which is the start of the Missouri River, and followed the Missouri all the way down to the Mississippi River confluence. And then I wanted to finish at the Arch. So I did the last 15 miles of the trip on the Mississippi down to the Arch. This trip came about as a result of many different things. I got into paddling really quite a bit in 2010. A friend of mine was signed up for this crazy race called the MR340. That's the Missouri River 340-mile race from Kansas City to St. Charles. I got roped into joining my friend Charlie for that initial Missouri River paddle race. And since then, I've done the race 6 times, but that really turned me on to the river community, the paddling community, and through that, I learned that people do paddle entire rivers, whether that's the Mississippi or other rivers around the country or the world. And then I realized people paddle the whole Missouri, and that really intrigued me. And I started reading about it, reading books, reading blogs, watching presentations like this one about people who do the whole river. So in 2017, my wife and I were on our honeymoon out west. We took a massive road trip all over the western U.S., and we made it to Three Forks, Montana, where the Missouri River starts. And when I was there, I just had this feeling like I'm going to come back here someday. But the next time I come back here, I'll be putting a boat in the water and going down to St. Louis. Fast forward a couple of years, the opportunity came along to take extended time off to do the trip. I work in software and have for many years, and I asked the company that I was working at the time, would they be okay with me taking 3 or 4 months off to do this trip? I didn't expect them to say yes, but I was prepared to take the time off anyway. And if they had a job waiting for me when I came back, even better. Luckily, they were very accommodating, very flexible with me, and gave me the time off to do this trip. And I did have a job when I came back. So that's the sort of the origin story of the trip. And I was off and running and planning. So this is the entire river. Where I started is actually just on the border of Wyoming and Montana in far southwest Montana. And then the river jogs up north across Montana, down through North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and then into Missouri with my finish planned at the Arch in St. Louis. I was extremely blessed to paddle an amazing work of art. I was fully prepared to paddle a different boat, a sea kayak. I had all prepared. And then in December 2018, before my trip, my good friend Shane Camden, who operates Paddle Stop New Haven, a wonderful brewery and paddle shop in New Haven, Missouri, called me and he said, I'm going to build you a kayak for your trip. And I was just blown away. I was shocked and delighted that he was going to do this for me. So with him, collaborated on what type of boat I wanted. We did lots of fittings and preparation, make sure it's the right size. It had plenty of storage for me to store all my gear, but it ended up being this incredible 20-foot cedar strip custom kayak, one of a kind, built by Shane. and it turned out to be the absolute best boat I could have dreamed of in doing a trip like this. So breaking down this presentation into kind of three main parts, actually three or four main parts, but just kind of break it down into bite-sized chunks. So the first 100 miles was on the Madison River. And why did I pick the Madison? Madison is one of the three rivers that forms the Missouri, the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin rivers. And lots of people have done the Jefferson River because that is the ultimate source. That is the longest tributary of the Missouri. But once I started learning about the area and the region up there, the Madison really stuck out to me as just a gorgeous river that goes through a very picturesque Montana River Valley. It's world-class fishing, fly fishing, and as I started looking into the trip, I wanted to add a little bit more and see a little bit more of where the Missouri comes from. And I was shocked to learn that the water that comes out of Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone National Park eventually becomes the Madison, which eventually becomes the Missouri. And to realize that there is a water connection between one of our most sacred national parks in the country, in the world for that matter, it connects via water to my home waters of St. Louis. The water coming out of Old Faithful eventually runs in front of the arch, which I thought was fascinating. So why not connect those two amazing places? This is my put-in right on the Madison. Just behind me there, about a quarter mile, is Yellowstone Park, which you're technically not allowed to paddle in, but I started just outside the park where the Madison exits the park. My wife flew up to Bozeman. I drove up with the boat, and we spent a couple nice days checking out the area, and then she put me in the water and drove back home, and I was off and running. This was mile one of my trip on the Madison.
Madison
remote,
River,
but obviously very
mile from Yellowstone.
picturesque, very beautiful stretch of
First
water.
strokes of the trip. Mile one of 2,400 plus. Degrees, slightly breezy, partly cloudy. Couldn't ask for a better day.
So this was a gorgeous day. I had good luck to start the trip, but the first 2 weeks in late May in Montana turned out to be pretty chilly and quite a bit of rain. So a lot of days I would spend making sure I was staying dry and warm in my boat, and then once I camped for the evening, quickly got my tent set up and got in the tent and tried to stay dry and warm as much as possible. My first portage, there's Hebgen Lake in Montana, and I did bring a cart so I could do short portages. And for the longer portages coming up later in the trip, I'll kind of talk about that. But for some of these initial portages around some of the early dams that I encountered, had a collapsible cart, and I was able to fairly easily portage. It did get a little bit treacherous at times, but I was able to do some portaging. Earthquake Lake I also encountered pretty quickly on the Madison. In 1959, there was a massive, massive earthquake that caused a landslide that actually blocked the Madison River and formed this lake. It's a pretty sad story. There was a campground, and I think it was in August that this earthquake hit, and quite a few campers were buried by the landslide and have never been unearthed. The trees you're seeing in the lake here were from the 1950s that were on the riverbanks at the time, but as this lake formed, the trees are still there, so pretty eerie kind of paddling in and out of those trees. This is the landslide, and as part of the clearing of that landslide, they had to build this channel. But this is all Class 5 rapids, so I happily portage around this. There's no way a wooden boat would make it through a stretch like this. So on the Madison, I did have to portage around some Class 4 or 5 rapids. It is a very genuine mountain stream, and there are relaxing parts, but then there are parts like this that you have to deal with. So this is me portaging around those rapids, going down the road just on the side, pretty unglamorous. But once I hit some of the free-flowing parts of the Madison, it was absolutely gorgeous. I think this is my put-in below that portage, and you can see it's a pretty fast-flowing mountain stream, and the boat was more than capable. It's one of my early campsites along the Madison as I'm making my way into Three Forks, Montana. I believe this was in a cow pasture, and I had to make sure that no cows were going to disturb me at my campsite throughout the evening. So once I made it to Three Forks, it was about a 550-mile stretch down to another landmark, Fort Peck Dam. But putting in on the Missouri River was, like I said, a sacred spot for me. I had been to Three Forks a couple years earlier, and this picture is literally standing where Lewis and Clark stood to determine which of the Three Forks of the tributaries would take them over the Rockies to the Pacific, their ultimate goal. So I climbed up this bluff and literally standing in the footprints of Lewis and Clark, and I found myself lucky enough to do that a couple times on the trip, knowing exactly where Lewis and Clark had stopped, where they had made decisions, and where they had deliberated on their trip. This is meeting Norm Miller, who's the godfather of Missouri River paddling. He lives in Montana, and met up with him and paddled for a day or two as we made our way down the first few miles of the Missouri. But just an encyclopedia of knowledge. He operates the Missouri River Paddlers Facebook group, so just to have his expertise and his blessing to start this trip was fantastic. Another big lake I encountered early on, Canyon Ferry, and I was told this is probably only a handful of days throughout the year that the water is this calm. It's a notoriously very windy lake, and you have to be very careful when you're traversing and crossing the lake. I paddled with another good friend, a local to the area, Jim Emanuel, who had paddled the entire Missouri the year before I did. So I had his guidance and expertise and got to stay at his house, his wife Vicky. They got a beautiful house right on the banks of Canyon Ferry. And for 4 nights I stayed with them, and every night it was pouring rain, about 40 degrees, and I was counting my blessings that I was indoors, out of the elements for the challenging weather conditions that there were. Gates of the Mountains, again, another extremely picturesque area. The river goes through these massive canyons, and a lot of times, as Lewis and Clark experienced as well, you don't think the river is even going to go through this area. You look ahead and there's nothing but cliffs and rocks, but the river does make its way through this area. Here's a little video of going through the Gates of the Mountain stretch. I didn't have any close encounters with bears, but this is about the only place I did see some bears. I was paddling through the gates and looked up on one of the mountainsides, and there were a couple bear cubs climbing up the mountainside, so I was happy to steer clear of any close encounters. But tons of wildlife, tons of beauty, just a obviously incredible natural area. Like I said, there were a lot of dams in the early part of the river, so this is actually a dammed stretch of the river, so not a lot of current going through here. So a few portages here and there. as you make your way out of the dammed section of the Missouri. This is camping later that night with Jim Emanuel, just another picturesque spot in the Gates. Man Gulch was an area that I was sort of aware of that's also in the Gates, and the history of this place is that back in I think it was the 1940s or 50s maybe, there was a massive wildfire, and a crew of smoke jumpers jumped out at the plane to fight the fire, and as they were fighting the fire in this canyon, the winds just took the fire straight up the canyon towards the firemen, and most of the crew ran up the gulch, trying to get to the crest to get out of the way of the fire. Unfortunately, almost all of the firemen died, and at each point where there's where they found the fireman's body, there's memorials set up. And I got to hike this area with Jim Emanuel, who's a former firefighter from California, and just being in that area, seeing this, taking it all in, and being with Jim was a very impactful experience. As I paddled through Cascade, Montana, another small town, I was looking for the boat ramp, and I was planning on camping for the evening. But as I passed this house in town, a guy on a porch, I yelled up to him. I said, "Hey, do you know where the boat ramp is?" He's like, "Well, where are you going?" And I said, "St. Louis." And he's like, "Well, come on over here." So I paddled over to his house, and little did I know, Terry makes these beautiful wooden kayaks in his shed. And me paddling a wooden boat, it was just fate to be able to randomly meet Terry. Had a wonderful evening with him and his wife, and a wonderful breakfast before I took off again. But he, showed me around his incredible workshop and these gorgeous works of art that he makes. And I eventually made it to Great Falls, Montana, series of 5 huge waterfalls that you obviously have to portage around. There's no paddling through these waterfalls, but spent a couple days in Great Falls with some good friends, resupply, rest up for the continuation of the trip. But just another gorgeous town to check out. Then I was on to another very picturesque section of the Missouri, getting into the Missouri River Breaks National Monument, campsite there. And then Decision Point, again, standing in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. They stood here and decided which is the true Missouri and which is a tributary that would not lead them to the Rocky Mountains. This is where the Marias River joins the Missouri, and back in the Lewis and Clark days, there is no apparent way to tell which is the true Missouri. So they paused for a week and sent expeditions up both routes to try to determine which is the true Missouri. And eventually they found the Great Falls of Montana, which they had known about, knowing that they're correctly still on the Missouri. Missouri River Breaks, famous for stunning landscapes, white cliffs, sandstone bluffs for multiple hundreds of miles. Again, just a gorgeous natural area, all protected. So there's no roads for dozens and dozens of miles, no towns along the way, just serene natural settings. I did stop and hike up to the famous hole in the wall structure. You see a tiny hole way up there. Looks pretty small, but I did hike up there, and you can kind of see the hole in the wall out there with the scale of the boats, a couple canoes down in the river below. And just, yeah, again, fantastic rock structures all along the way. This is kind of a 360-degree view as I was paddling through the breaks section. Um, 2019 was a fairly high water year. In early 2019, we had massive flooding down through Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and I was, I was doubtful. I was wondering if I was going to be able to even do this trip that year because of such devastating floods along the way. So as I started my trip, there was still flooding going on further downstream. But as I made my way down, the floodwaters kind of receded. But this was still relatively high water, which did have its advantages since it wasn't low water. Most times when I paddled over to shore, I was on dry land since the river was at its peak. Didn't really have to deal with a ton of mud. I read a lot about horror stories of people having to deal with the mud and the quicksand and crossing a quarter-mile of mud just to get to dry land to be able to camp.
GoPro, stop video.
Relatively lucky
GoPro, stop video.
circumstances. There were homesteads along the Missouri River breaks as well. So, the history behind these is back in the 1800s, the U.S. was trying to settle as much of the western lands as they could, providing free or very, very cheap land to settlers who, promised to develop, farm, and civilize the area. So a lot of the structures are still there of these old homesteads. Some very well preserved. I walked into a couple homesteads and there was still old cans on the shelf and old rusty stove that's still in there. So amazing history is still around. Woke up early one morning from camping, walked up this hill. This is around the spot where Lewis and Clark first encountered the snow-capped peaks way off in the distance of the Rocky Mountains, knowing that they were, making their way upstream eventually to the Rocky Mountains. So again, standing in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. I encountered my first of three major reservoirs on the Missouri. This is Fort Peck Lake, and you quickly transitioned from a flowing river to just a massive lake. And that presented its own set of challenges. Lots of wide open crossings. You may be 2-3 miles from land at any given time, so keeping an eye on the weather, on the wind, is extremely important. And potentially dealing with waves, pretty big waves along the way as well. Kind of planning your route, planning your crossings is kind of another logistical piece of navigating these reservoirs. I'm not a big fisherman. However, I did bring a fishing pole on the trip, and Jim Emanuel made sure I had the right lures for some of the water I would soon be paddling in. So late afternoon on Fort Peck Lake, got a little bite and snagged a northern pike.
Look at that! Woo!
And I was really at a loss of how to handle the situation. And I had heard that northern pikes are dangerous and they have super sharp teeth, so trying to be extremely careful in dealing with the fish, trying to here attempting to get the hook out. I did not plan on keeping the fish or cooking and eating it. It would have been great eating, but I was just gonna let him go here. And eventually he has enough of me fumbling around, and he's gonna be on his way here in a second. Saturday night, right? I can't promise you that I can win for sure if it comes to a fight. All I can do is say I love you if that'll make you feel alright. And there he goes. Broke the line. He's off. I was terrified. But absolutely beautiful camping on Fort Peck Lake. Tons of tiny little fingers of land that jut into the lake, so can paddle up to any one of those and have an extremely beautiful camp spot. Good hiking, good views to watch the evening weather come in. And of course the sunsets, typical campsite setup here on Fort Peck. And one day I did, I took a little break from paddling and I hiked way up one of these small little fingers of land as far as I could go. And kind of just randomly in the middle of a big pasture, I saw a little fenced off area, and I went over here and saw this stone here randomly. And just noted the spot, and then I think I did try to contact the family, the Wieberts, listed here to kind of tell them what I had found. I don't think we had made the connection, but I thought it was a fascinating piece of history just to randomly encounter this. So this is Fort Peck Dam. This is, if not now, it was at one point the largest dam in the world. Big hydraulically filled dam built during the 1930s during the Works Progress Administration era to create the reservoir. But it's a 4-mile long dam, and it's a 1 mile in width total footprint of the dam. So spent a couple days in Fort Peck, took the dam tour, and relaxed and resupplied and so forth in Fort Peck. Next section was Fort Peck down to Bismarck, about 21 days, just shy of 500 river miles there, encountering my next big reservoir, Lake Sakakawea. Just below Fort Peck Dam, pulled over on the side, take a little break, and down on my feet were a bunch of buffalo bones, as well as, I guess this is an elk antler. Just seeing some pretty cool artifacts along the way. This was kind of my evening ritual, pull over, find a decent spot. I didn't usually paddle into the evening. I like to set up camp around, 4 or 5 o'clock. Plenty of sunlight left to set up camp, boil some, rehydrate some of my food. I had done a lot of food dehydrating prior to the trip, and that was my main source of food along the way, and it worked out well. I have tons of different meals and recipes I used along the way, and they're fantastic, really healthy, nutritious, and pretty tasty as well. Paddled into Wolf Point, Montana, and on the other side of the river there is Indian reservation land, and I encountered a little bar restaurant at this spot, quarter-mile walk from where I was camping, and it happened to be the night that the St. Louis Blues hockey team won the Stanley Cup. So I got to sit there in the bar, cheer on the team, and all the locals were very perplexed that there's a guy from St. Louis in the bar cheering for this hockey team. But when I left the bar that night, came out, this was a sunset, and I thought it'd be, that's a pretty good day. Further getting into Montana, encountering more agriculture, and a lot of these here were pumps that simply pump the water from the river to irrigate the crops, irrigate the farm fields. And while 2019 was a very high water year, no danger of removing too much water, but as we move more and more into the drought era, this will likely become a pretty big issue, is how the water of the Missouri River gets handled, where it goes, who's using it, who has the rights to use it, and so forth. Those are going to be issues that we constantly encounter. This is getting to the border of North Dakota, very eastern edge of Montana. And I happened to arrive at Fort Union during the rendezvous, so reenactment of the 1800s, very genuine reenactors. All of their gear, everything they have is era based, very accurate to the times. I stayed with a lovely gentleman called Jeff Brown, and I was just planning on setting up my tent here at the rendezvous, and he's like, no, Mark, you can't have a modern tent here. That's not allowed. He's like, you can sleep in my tent. So I slept in his canvas tent, and the next morning I was packing up my sleeping bag, and I just kind of had it in the corner of the tent, and Jeff's like, Mark, we gotta cover up your gear, because if somebody looks in this tent and they see this modern gear, they're gonna give me hell. So we're gonna cover that up for you. I'm like, all right, Jeff, no problem. So got to spend the rendezvous, met some amazing folks. It was a great experience. And this is Fort Union. This is where the rendezvous was happening. A reconstructed, genuine fort. This was an early fur trading fort along the Missouri. Lots of steamships made it up here to trade and bring furs back to civilization. And just like clockwork, as soon as I crossed the Montana border into North Dakota, this is probably within the first couple hundred yards of North Dakota, is when you're going to start encountering oil wells, fracking operations, natural gas mining, all of the fun that comes with that. So moving quickly into untouched natural landscapes, into the some of the uglier parts of the river in terms of mining, oil drilling, and so forth. This is a spot I camped in. Kind of hard to see here, but I think I counted 10 or 12 fires off in the distance of burning off excess gas as it's mined and pumped out of the ground. Here's one of those operations, kind of up close. Not still a beautiful natural area, but interspersed with these ugly, noisy, stinky drilling operations. Lake Skakawea, second big, massive reservoir. And all the challenges of wide open water, but you got to encounter some incredible beauty along the way. When you get into Lake Sakakawea, a mandatory stop for any paddler is Tobacco Gardens Marina and Resort. And I pulled into Tobacco Gardens, and our river mom, Peggy, runs the resort. And as soon as I arrived in the resort, she said, "Mark, I got a cabin over there for you. Go ahead and set up your stuff." And then she owns a shop and restaurant, and she's like, "Mark, it's rib night, so come on in. We'll fix you a big plate of ribs. Got a beer cooler. Take as much as you want. If you want any snacks from the shop, help yourself. Here's a t-shirt for you." And she's just the most incredible person, and River Angel. And she said, "Well, what are you planning on? Are you planning on staying here a couple days?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm probably gonna stay and relax and clean up a little bit, resupply." And she's like, "Well, tomorrow you're gonna go on this wagon train." I was like, "Absolutely, I will absolutely do a wagon train." And so this was a start of like their county fair that they had, and a bunch of locals start out in the countryside and pack up their horse and carriages, and they cross the prairie into town to kick off the county fair. So I get to ride along for a day on one of these beauties. Just thought this was interesting. The wagon train with the oil rigs in the background towering over. And this is Peggy again, our river mom, River Angel Supreme. If you ever find yourself in western North Dakota, definitely swing through and stop into Tobacco Gardens. This is one of the nights on the lake, and the light pollution from the gas oil operations is just insane. I think the sky was brighter here than I would encounter in downtown St. Louis. The light pollution from these operations is insane. So yeah, I did encounter a few days where it was unsafe to paddle. Here's good evidence of that. Just wind, waves, rain made the water a miserable place to be, and being in no hurry to get on the water. You intersperse your off days here and there. Hopefully you're at a good campground or spot that you're able to spend a couple days. This happened to be on an Indian reservation where there was a casino conveniently located a quarter mile from where I camped. So I spent multiple days in the all-you-can-eat buffet, just loading up as many calories as I could. I think I tried to go paddle the next day, and the water looked like this once again. So I happily took another day in the buffet. Prickly pear cactus along the way. So interesting seeing different foliage, different life along the river. Never expected to see cactus along the Missouri River. Another spot is a beautiful beach along Lake Sakakawea. Again, you do a lot of these big, wide open water crossings, and again, you have to make sure that the weather is clear. Make sure a storm or the wind isn't going to roll up on you unexpectedly, kind of like this. This was like later in the day. I was paddling and noticed a storm rolling in behind me, and I beelined it to this spot where there was a little stand of trees. There's very few trees along the way in this section of the river, so some order of shelter can be provided by trees. So as soon as I got to this spot, the storm rolled in. I flipped up my umbrella, turned it sideways, and started blocking the sideways rain that was pelting me. This is the Garrison Dam at the end of Lake Sakakawea. Again, another massive massive dam that creates the lake and the reservoir. Then just below the dam, I think Norm Miller had told me about this. There's a massive petrified tree still in the river. You can see this via Google Maps. It's so big, and no trees of this size exist in North Dakota. So just kind of evident of the history of our climate and the natural evolution of climates. At one point, being trees this size were very common in the area, and this one is petrified and it's still there and accessible on the river. Washburn, getting down a little further in North Dakota. And then the next section is Bismarck down to Sioux City, Iowa, which includes one of the most challenging reservoirs along the way, probably the most challenging reservoir of Lake Oahe. I did encounter my very first sandbar to camp on, and that's a lovely experience, being able to set up camp on the sand. Typical Missouri River camping that I'm used to is on the sand, so it was great to finally be on sand underfoot. So like I said, Lake Oahe is 231 miles long. Unlike the other reservoirs, it runs north to south, so it's notoriously treacherous for weather. You have wind and storm systems typically coming from west to east, and so that is, you never have the wind at your back. You either have a headwind or it's coming from right to left. So again, constantly keeping vigilant on the weather. There's natural beauty, and then there's not so natural beauty along the way. This is on Lake Oahe. And then later in the day, one day on the lake, I noticed the storm clouds forming, moving into the area. So very quickly found a spot to camp. And I happened to have a little bit of cell phone service, I think, and where I was planning to camp, I saw that this insane storm system was moving in. So I hunkered down, tied up my boat, got my tent set up sort of under the shelter of this very small tree just to have some windbreak, and just waited for the storm to roll in. So I think around 9 p.m. I was in my tent holding on for dear life, trying to keep the tent from collapsing on me, holding onto the tent poles, peeking out of the tent to make sure my boat hadn't gotten washed into the river. But it was probably the worst weather night I had along the way. But gave way to incredible beauty. Again, this was right after a crossing. I think I had crossed from that water tower you see in the far distance. It's about a 6-mile crossing to get to here. Lots of camps, like I said, with the reservoirs being so high. Most of the times I paddled up to shore, and there wasn't a lot of mud. It was mostly dry land. That in a normal year, the water is probably 30 or 40 feet lower, and so I was hitting high ground at some of these camp spots. Just beautiful sunsets as well. Made it to the end of Lake Oahe at Pierre, South Dakota, and met up with the wonderful Jack and Sue Cool. Jack had paddled the Missouri River a year or two before I did, and so I made contact with them, stayed with Jack and Sue a night or two. But as I mentioned, River Angels, the network of people who just want to help out paddlers, is incredible. Almost any town you come into, you can either contact somebody ahead of time, or a lot of times my encounters were seemingly random. Run into somebody at the boat ramp and they ask what you're doing, and all of a sudden they want to help you out as much as possible with a place to stay, or give you a ride, or give you food or beer or whatever. So it's just an incredible experience. Meeting the people along the way is the highlight of any trip down the river. I think Jack took this picture as he put me back in at Pier to continue on my way. I mentioned my umbrella previously as a way to take shelter from sideways rain, but in addition to that, it also provides excellent sailing. Had one of the rare days I had the winds at my back, so I put down the paddle and put up the umbrella and managed to knock out a bunch of miles just doing some MacGyver type sailing just below pier. This is a picture for the Instagram feed for Paddle Stop New Haven and Timber Longboard Company. Just a nice shot on one of the beaches on Lake Sharp. Paddled into Chamberlain, South Dakota, and randomly met up with Scott. And Scott, he has the purple hat. He had paddled the Missouri River quite a few years ago, and he was in the middle of a bike trip across a good portion of the U.S. and happened to be in Chamberlain when I was. So we shared a meal and some beverages and camped together. And about 4 a.m. we were woken up at our campsite by the camp host, and everyone at the campsite had to go to the bathrooms to take shelter from a tornado that was coming through town. So we took shelter for a bit, got back to our tents. Scott's tent was flat on the ground, covered in water. My tent was still standing, but the tent poles were quite bent. So we cleaned up, got another couple hours of sleep before we continued on. But another harrowing weather experience there. Some of the last few lakes, Lake Francis Case, another beautiful one. Getting down into Nebraska, this is a massive colony of cliff swallows. And then the last lake before the river becomes free-flowing all the way to St. Louis, Lewis and Clark Lake, another beautiful lake. And I think this is my second to last or last night on the reservoirs before getting. And I was very eager to get to a river that had current where I could really start putting some miles in. This is just above Sioux City, and in the picture there's 3 states pictured. There's Iowa on the left, Nebraska on the right, and I'm standing on the last little spit of land in South Dakota, which I think it's the Big Sioux River that comes in there on the left and hits the Missouri right at this 3-state confluence. There's a wonderful Lewis and Clark Museum in Sioux City. I spent a couple days in Sioux City for my birthday at the end of July. My sister, 2 nephews came up, and my parents as well. And we had a great little reunion. Not having seen my family in months, filled my soul to be able to hang out with them and spend a couple days there. I'm an urban paddler at heart. Spend a lot of time around the local rivers here in St. Louis, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Merrimack, and I love exploring, the urban infrastructure that goes along with the rivers. And as I was paddling through Sioux City, I saw this tunnel. I was like, well, when am I going to be back here with a boat? So I paddled up into the tunnel as far as I could. I think this runs under one of the interstates, but river continues. This tributary continues on into downtown Sioux City. So I made it a little ways as far as I could go, and checked out the sort of the underbelly of Sioux City. So kind of getting into the home stretch, Missouri River from Sioux City down to the Mississippi confluence was about 732 miles, but quickly putting away miles here in free-flowing current only took about 19 days to do this portion. But this, like I said, this was a portion that was heavily affected by flooding earlier in the summer, and it was still very, very high water when I came through. This is a town that still has water up in some of the houses and some of the backyards there along the way, which made camping quite a challenge. But I got to Omaha. There's an old swinging railroad bridge as you approach Omaha. And then leaving Omaha, the wind turbine blades on their way from east to west to points beyond to some of the power generating windmill farms out west. So as I mentioned, you get down into Nebraska, there's actually towns along the way who have pretty developed campsites and towns right on the river, which I didn't fully expect. But getting into these campgrounds that had been catastrophically flooded earlier in the year, these were not open. They weren't restored or cleaned up yet from the flooding. So I was kind of doing some stealth camping in some of these spots. Didn't get too much trouble, but setting up in some very overgrown and flooded out areas. Um, and as far as I know, the river came up so fast earlier in the year that even campers' RVs didn't have time to get out, and saw a couple instances like this along the way of RVs and campers abandoned and destroyed by the river. I believe this is the first barge I encountered in Rulo, Nebraska. Barges only can travel as far as Sioux City before you hit the dam, and barges travel no further north on the river. But not a lot of river traffic as opposed to the Mississippi, where it can be like a traffic jam at some points, but didn't have to deal with too much barge traffic or barge waves or anything like that. Thought this was a cool little spot, just a massive old oak tree with a school bus parked right next to it. Don't know what the story was there. Getting down into more of the industrial sections, power generating facilities along the river closer to Kansas City. And then a familiar spot to anyone who has done the MR340 before. This is Caw Point, the start of the MR340 race, just upstream of Kansas City itself. Spent a couple days in Kansas City, met up with some friends, and from here on out, this was a home stretch. I was very, very familiar with this stretch of river from Kansas City down to St. Louis. So as getting the feeling that my trip was slowly coming to an end, with some pretty awesome days still yet to come. I met up with some paddler friends in Kansas City, and they paddled with me. We did a 70-mile day from Kansas City to Lexington, I believe. And that was my longest mileage day on the river. Not that we were in racing mode, but these guys are used to paddling long miles, and it was a perfect day with fast water, and we shared stories and just had great camaraderie on the river that day. This is closer to Rocheport, near Columbia, Missouri, the beautiful cliffs of Rocheport there. And then I stopped at Cooper's Landing for the evening, and some friends of mine from Columbia came down, Steve Schnarr and Melanie Cheney from Missouri River Relief, great Columbia-based river folks, and got to spend the evening with them. More about Missouri River Relief later on in the presentation, but it was great to see familiar faces. It really feeds the soul after being on the river away from people for so long. More good friends, New Haven. The master craftsman of my boat is there in the back, Shane Camden. He's paddling one of his stand-up boards that he built. And then that's Lance and Gary. In the foreground, they run Astral Glass in New Haven, glassblowers by trade, river paddlers by nature, but got to spend a day paddling with them. They've done a good portion of the Missouri River as well. So again, sharing stories and being with people who have shared your experience is just incredible. It's like nothing else. So my boat held up very well, but it did suffer some sun damage on the top of the boat. Some of the epoxy and varnish started peeling a little bit, and Shane, wanting my boat to look amazing for my finish in St. Louis, we spent an evening late into the night, scraping, peeling off some of the layers, and then revarnishing it just so the boat looked presentable as I finished my trip. This picture is taken where the brewery now stands. If you've had the pleasure of having a beer inside Paddle Stop New Haven, this was what it was like before the brewery was opened by Shane. So finally made it down to the end of the Missouri, and so the last day was a little 15-mile stretch on the Mississippi down to the Arch. And I was lucky enough to be joined by some river friends for the last day of paddling. Some of these folks I've been paddling with for years. Others, it was their first time on a big river. So the last day was not without excitement, making sure that my friends stayed safe and were able to navigate, as we made our way from the Missouri onto the Mississippi. Charlie there on the left, he was my MR340 partner back in 2010. So to a degree, he's responsible for all this insanity. So paddled into St. Louis in the mid-afternoon heat. I think it was like 90 degrees. And on the shore, I had about 50 or 60 friends and family waiting for me. And I remember, arriving at the arch and seeing my mom with a very red face, so hot, and just grateful that she stuck it out there to watch me come in, along with tons of friends and family. Extremely emotional experience finishing the trip. I'm blessed enough to be born and raised in St. Louis and have that connection. And so being able to see those people welcome me in was just incredible. And I always, any paddler who comes through St. Louis, whether they're doing the Missouri, the Mississippi, I always try to make an effort to be there at the arch when they finish or pass through, because I know how amazing it is to have somebody there welcoming you in to finish your trip, or just to be there for anyone. So I try to pay back all of the generosity and care that I received along the river as much as I possibly can, and I'll continue to do that the rest of my life. So this was a trip. The yellow points being spots I stopped or camped at along the way. Total of 96 days. Obviously, a life-changing trip. Missouri River Relief, I did this trip for myself, obviously, but, an important organization to me over the years, Missouri River Relief, they specialize in getting people on the river, educating people about the river, cleaning up the rivers. And so you can join trash cleanups that they do up and down the river. They do educational events quite often. I managed to raise about $5,000 leading up to my trip, for a donation to Missouri River Relief so they can continue their amazing work. Please check them out if you haven't before. Come on out for a river cleanup and meet the great folks who make Missouri River Relief what it is, and who keep our rivers clean. So thanks so much for listening. If you want to, dive a little bit deeper on my trip, I did keep a blog during my trip, paddlestlouis.com. Lots of posts about my trip, get into all of the planning of my trip, my food dehydrating, the trip itself, people I met, pictures, stories. It's all there. So feel free to visit that. Shoot me any questions that you have. I'm always eager to talk about the river, and I take any opportunity I can to do it. So thank you once again for listening. Hope to see you all on the river.